Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is Amna Gul from the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication. We're back with the course Communication Theories 2, bearing the code GMC 312. It's our 16th lecture, and the topic today is difficulties in implementing scientific method. Previously, we did discuss in our last lecture, we did discuss scientific method in detail. So we'll be moving towards discussion of the difficulties only. However, I'll give a short reference to what scientific method is. We said it was a search for truth through accurate observation and interpretation of fact. Now, this is something very simple. I would like to share here a very simple and short video which actually explains scientific method, and I thought a visual description was far better than just an oral one. So let's go watch that first, and then we'll move towards the difficulties. So here we are.
Dear Tim and Moby, I'm watering my plant all the time and its leaves are still turning brown. What's going wrong? From Ben. Well, you could just look up the plant gardening book, but this is a really great opportunity to talk about scientific methods. Often, when people are trying to understand the world around them, they come across a problem they just don't know the answer to. This is where step-by-step methods of scientific problem-solving come into play. Looks like most have...
Like something as simple as watering plants. So the person is having some problems with watering plants, like he's watering the plants, but still the leaves are turning brown. So even for that, scientific method can be used.
The same problem with his plant. The first step in scientific problem solving is to recognize the problem. Right. The plant is dying even though it's getting water every day. Why? To solve this problem, we first need to understand what we already know. Okay, plants need water. What kind of plant is that? Fig tree, right. Now we need to make some observations about the plant. The leaves are brown and falling off, and the soil is wet and squishy. Next, we make an inference. An inference is a conclusion about our observations. From what we've observed, we could infer that Moby is watering his plant too much. Now we translate our inference into a hypothesis. Well, a hypothesis is any statement we can test with an experiment. What about fig plants should only be watered once a week? Well, sure, it's just a guess, but after our observations, at least it's an educated guess. We'll need to come up with an experiment to test this hypothesis. Here's the plan. We've got 3 healthy fig plants marked A, B, and C. They have the same type of pot, the same soil, and they're getting the same amount of sunlight, so the only variable is the amount of water they'll be getting. Plant A will not be watered at all. Plant B will be watered every day. And Plant C will be watered once a week. We'll check back in a month to see what's happened. Well, you know, it's been a month and I'm still wearing the same shirt. Let's record some new observations. Plant A doesn't look too good. B doesn't look so hot either. Whoa there, Plant C is doing alright. Time to analyze our data. Based on this experiment and our observations, it looks like the fig plant did best when it was only watered once a week. From that, we can conclude that fig plants grow best when they're watered once a week. Now we get to tell other people about our results and spread the word that fig plants only need watering once a week. Well, yeah, to be really sure, we should repeat this experiment several times, just to rule out accidents and variables that we may have forgotten to consider. But you get the point. Using scientific methods can help you be right more often, and not just in science class. You just have to make sure you do all the steps. If you form a hypothesis without making any observations, then you really are just guessing. And you'll never know if your hypothesis is true or not without testing it with an experiment.
So something as simple as watering plants, it can be studied through a scientific method to solve problems. Now the case that we just watched, or the video we just watched, that was an experiment. It was set in laboratory conditions. As we discussed earlier, humans do not grow up in laboratories. So it is very difficult to have study them through the scientific behavior. So in this lecture, we'll actually be discussing that the implementation of scientific method is difficult for those studying the social world, owing to 4 reasons. The first reason is most of the scientific, significant and interesting forms of human behavior are quite difficult to measure. See, we can easily measure the temperature at which water boils with ingenious and complex technology. We can even measure the weight of an atom or the speed at which the universe is expanding. But how do we measure something like civic duty? Should we count the incidence of voting? Maybe a person's decision not to vote is his or her personal expression of that duty. Let's try something a little easier, like measuring aggression in a television violence study. Can aggression be measured by counting how many times a child hits a rubber doll? Is gossiping about a neighbor an aggressive act? How do we measure an attitude, for example, a predisposition to do something rather than an observable action? What is 3 pounds of tendency to hold conservative political views or 16.7 millimeters of patriotism? So, actually, human behavior is very difficult to measure. See, for example, think about your moods. How can we measure how good are you feeling today? How can we measure how attentive you feel like today? Not about being attentive, how you feel like being attentive, or how much sincere you are towards your studies. It's very different. Like, we do not know, do we have to measure it in kgs or in pounds or in millimeters or in feet or in degree centigrade? How do we measure? We have no idea. So it's very difficult to measure. What is, like, you are happy or more happy? What is the difference between being happy and being more happy? We do not know. For you, the criteria might be something. For me, it might be something else. For another person, it might be something a lot different. So human behavior are very difficult to measure. That is why it is difficult to implement the scientific method for measuring human behavior or for studying the social world. Okay. Now think about, let me give you certain examples to think about. For example, let's talk about how do you feel about Pakistani media, the news media? Is it responsible reporting? Is it very responsible reporting? Is it irresponsible reporting? Is it very responsible reporting? Now, what's the difference between all these 4 categories that I just told you? Like responsible, very responsible, irresponsible, very responsible. So what's the difference? How do you take one news story or one news media outlet or all the news media outlet and tell, is it responsible or it is very responsible? Or is it irresponsible or is it very responsible? So you see, it's very difficult to measure your perception or anybody's perception about something. There are certain things that are observable actions. For example, when we talked about aggression is observable. But how do you count aggression? How can you tell that we tend to say this person is very aggressive, abbu bahut gusse wale hain, fine. But what is both gusse wale and what is like kam gusse wale? What is the difference between being more aggressive and lesser aggressive? So it is very difficult to set these standards. Same is the case, for example, about I told you in the earlier lectures, for example, we talked about certain things that, for example, playing with Barbie dolls destroys little girls' self-esteem. So how do you measure that the self-esteem is being destroyed? Is it being destroyed at a higher rate or at a lower rate? So it's kind of a very confusing mix of all these things. So first problem that we faced is that human behavior is very difficult to measure. Now let's move towards our second issue. That is, human behavior is exceedingly complex. See, human behavior does not easily lend itself to causal description. It is easy to identify a single factor that causes water to boil. Or, for example, that overwatering causes the plants to go, the leaves to go brown. But it has proved impossible to isolate single factors that serve as the exclusive cause of important actions of human behavior. Since human behavior is very complex, it is very difficult to single out one cause. Human behavior may simply be too complex to allow scientists to ever fully untangle the different factors that combine to cause observable actions. Let's once again think about your father. See, we usually have that fathers are quite aggressive, usually, okay? And many times it so happens that you are at a loss why your father is angry. He just came from his office or from his business, or he just came from outside, and the moment he enters the house and he scolds you for not studying enough. Now you're having your off days, for example, and you're at a loss why your studies, why the discussion about your study at during off days has come up. So you do not know that Abu had, for example, a very tough day, or there was some problem at work, or he was into an argument with someone and he got angry, and when he came back home he looked at you and he thought like he needed to give vent to his anger. You were the victim. So it's like very complex. You cannot work it out, you cannot untangle, you cannot isolate factors. See, in a scientific setup, in physical sciences, we can easily control the heat and atmospheric pressure in our boiling experiment, for example. We can control the elements in a chemistry experiment with relative ease. But if we want to develop a theory of the influence of mediated communication on political campaigns, how do we control which forms of media people choose to use? How do we control the amount of attention they pay to specific types of news? How do we measure how well or poorly they comprehend what they consume? How do we take into account factors that influenced people long before we started our research? See, for example, how do we measure the type and amount of political socialization fostered by parents, by schools, or peers? All these things, not to mention countless others, will influence the relationship between people's use of media and their behavior in an election. How can we be sure that what caused what? Voting might have declined even more without media coverage. Remember, the very same factors that lead one person to vote might lead another to stay home. So human behavior is way too complex. It's very difficult to figure out what causes what. For example, the same, let's suppose you're in a class and I give you an assignment, and the assignment is that you have to review a research paper. I give you the deadline, that this is the deadline. I give you the word count. I tell you about Turnitin. You have to put it on a Turnitin. So plagiarism, there is a plagiarism percentage. There's a word count you have to meet. There's a deadline that you need to meet. Now, the same instructions make some of you to work hard towards that assignment, while these very same instructions make some others amongst you to just give up hope. Okay, we cannot do this assignment. Like this much of a word count? Oh, plagiarism check? We cannot take it. The deadline? It's too near. Or you don't work. Oh, the deadline is so far. I'll work later on. So it's the same instructions, the same things, but people are very complex. So for example, you are a class of a score of students, or maybe a couple of scores, and then the same instructions work differently for all of you. Why? Because there are so many other influences on you. It's not just the teacher giving you a particular assignment or the teacher giving you a particular set of instructions, but your past experiences, your socialization, your perception about the teacher, about the course, about the type of work, your past experience with that teacher, that course, that type of work, the Turnitin application, all these things and many others, even the weather. If you're feeling hot, you feel like, oh God, I'm not feeling like doing anything. I don't understand it. So there's so many things that influence how you decide to react towards anything. Okay, so human behavior is very, very, very complex, and it is very difficult to implement scientific method to study social science or human behavior. Similarly, for example, when we do some studies on children, let's suppose we just want to see if screen time is associated with is having any negative effects on children. So once again, it's dependent on child to child. There are certain children who are very passive. There are certain children who are very shy. There are certain children who are hyperactive. So on different types of children, on the different personality traits, the same kind of screen time, the same violence viewing can have different effects. And once again, if you can actually, for your checking out effects, so those effects might vary in the types of, for example, some might become too lazy, some might become hyperactive once the screen is shut down. Similarly, some might learn a lot from screens. There's a lot of kids who are learning, for example, language. There are a lot of students or kids who are learning socialization through screen time. So once again, the effects are different because the people are different. The people are complex. Their minds work differently. They act differently. They take up things very differently. Having said that, now let's move towards the third difficulty, which is humans have goals and they are self-reflexive. We do not always behave in response to something that has happened. Very often, we act in response to something we hope or expect will happen. Moreover, we constantly revise our goals and make highly subjective determinations about their potential for success or failure. Now, imagine that you have to give a presentation. So, why do you panic for a presentation? Because you're actually expecting that your, for example, presentation would not be up to the mark. You are expecting something bad to happen, and that is why you are panicking. Or for example, you have to talk to your father about, yes, the accident you had. You like the bike, you had a accident and the bike was badly damaged. So how's your heartbeat? Why all this anxiety? Because you're expecting that your father is going to scold you for that, or he's gonna cut your allowances or anything like that. So we actually make subjective determinations about the potential for success or failure. So see, if water boils after the application, water, like we clearly know, we had this we were comparing this, so I'm still using that. We see that water boils after the application of heat. That's clear. Does the water think about boiling? No, it doesn't. It doesn't begin to experience boiling and then decide that it doesn't like the experience. But we kind of feel about it. We start feeling about the anxiety of how Abu is gonna scold us or how difficult our presentation is gonna be, and we start feeling anxiety about it or whatever different things we are feeling. We as humans, we think about our actions as well as our inactions. We reflect on our values, beliefs, and attitudes. Now let's compare once again with water. Water doesn't develop attitudes against boiling that lead it to misrepresent the amount of heat it is experiencing. See, if you develop an anxiety related to presentations, or you develop an anxiety related to facing your father, so even before you are into the presentation, you have a negative perception of failure. Or even before you're facing your father, you are anxious about it and you're having all these nervousness and stuff. Water doesn't do that. The water stops boiling when the heat is removed. As simple as that. It doesn't think about stopping or having trouble making up its mind. So the heat is removed, it stops boiling. Simple. It doesn't decide now I have to stop boiling. But once your presentation is over, you're still simply not anxiety free. Take time. And at times you carry on the experience of someone scolding you or having a bad presentation, and you carry that experience with you for longer hours. You're upset about it, or you are nervous whenever they are next times coming up. Water doesn't do that. If the heat stops, it stops boiling. And the next time he's not upset with heat for not staying with it, for example. It doesn't like it doesn't think about stopping, or it doesn't have trouble making up its mind. It doesn't have friends. The water doesn't have friends who tell it that boiling is fun and it should be continued even when there is insufficient heat. We have friends who tell us a lot of things about a lot of things, and we tend to change our perspectives about those things. Okay? But people do think about their actions, and they frequently make these actions contingent on their expectations that something will happen. See, humans are not billiard balls propelled solely by forces external to them. This was explained by psychologist Albert Bandura. Billiard balls, I hope you know what billiard is. Billiard balls cannot change the shape of the table, the size of the pockets, or intervene in the paths they take, or even decide whether to play the game at all. In contrast, humans not only think, but individually and collectively shape the form those external forces take, and even determine whether or not they come into play. Murray Gell-Mann, the physicist Nobelist, underscored the influential role of the personal determinants when he remarked, "Imagine how hard physics would be if particles could think." Particles, atoms, they don't think, they don't decide we need to do this thing, we need to do that thing, the weather is like this, so we need to do this, the circumstances are like that, so we need to do that, we are feeling like this, so this should happen, this should not happen. So just this thinking capability of humans, it makes things quite very different. Last but not the least, the simple notion of causality is sometimes troubling when it is applied to ourselves. See, we have no trouble accepting that heat causes water to boil at 100 degrees centigrade at sea level. We do not have any trouble. We relish such causal statements in the physical world. We want to know how things work, what makes things happen. As much as we might like to be thrilled by horror movies or science fiction films in which physical laws are continually violated, we trust the operation of these laws in our daily lives. But we often resent causal statements when they are applied to ourselves. We can't see the expanding universe or the breakup of water molecules at the boiling point. So we are willing to accept the next best thing, which is the word of an objective expert, that is, a scientist. But we can see ourselves watching cable news and not voting. Or we can see ourselves learning about people from lands we have never visited. So, why do we need experts telling us about ourselves or explaining to us why we do things? We are not so easily influenced by media. We say that. But ironically, most of us are convinced that other people are much more likely to be influenced by media, which is called the third person effect. So, although we don't need to be protected from media influence, others might. They're not as smart as we are. Don't you think? We all think like this about ourselves, most of us. So, we are our own men and women, independent, free thinking individuals. We aren't affected by those McDonald's ads. We simply bought that Big Mac, fries, and a large Coke because, darn it, we deserved a break today. And after all, we did need to eat something, and the McDonald's didn't happen to be right on the way back to the hostel. So you see, we kind of have it very differently when it is applied to ourselves. Just because of that, we always think we are smart. Nothing affects us, but it affects the other person. So these other people, they need to be protected. But for us, no, there is no need for that. So as we move ever more deeply into the ever evolving communication revolution, we need an understanding of media theory to guide our actions and decisions. It should recognize that all social theory is a human construction and that it is dynamic, always changing as society, technology, and people change. This dynamism can be readily seen in the transformation of our understanding of the process of mass communication itself. New communication technologies have changed traditional notions of the mass audience, the mass communicator, and the relationships between the two. To understand this change, we rely on social science and its theories. Social science is sometimes controversial because it suggests causal relationships between things in the social world and people's attitudes, values, and behaviors. So, for that matter, since we do not accept these causal relationships for ourselves, so we find it controversial. And similarly, when we said earlier, it's not predictable, humans are very much complex, so it's not a linear thing. It doesn't take a single path. Human behavior is quite unpredictable. In the physical sciences, causal relationships are often easily visible and measurable. In the study of human behavior, however, they rarely are. Human behavior is quite difficult to quantify, as we talked about in terms of millimeters and kilograms and stuff like that, degree centigrade. Human behavior is often very complex and often goal oriented. Social science and human behavior make a problematic fit. The situation is further complicated because social science itself is somewhat variable. It has many purposes, it has many forms, and can serve very different purposes. So that's all for today. Thank you.